He wants to upset me. He wants to upset you.
Most miért beszélsz olyan angolul?
Mert ebben állapodtunk meg.
Okay.
Beszélhetek magyarul.
No. He's
I don't mean
troubled,
anything
but he's
bad.
not crazy. Crazy means something else.
Hi friends, I'm back with another film spotlight. Today I'm going to highlight the film Blue Heron by writer-director Sophy Romvari. She's a Canadian filmmaker and auteur who's worked in short films for a while, where she's explored some of the family dynamics that she grew up in, and Blue Heron is her first feature directorial debut. So in the late 1990s, 8-year-old Sasha and her Hungarian immigrant family relocate to a new home on Vancouver Island. Their fresh start is interrupted by an increasingly dangerous behavior coming from her brother Jeremy, the family's older child. So Blue Heron follows this family of 6 settling into their new home and exploring the internal dynamics that are slowly revealed through the eyes of Sasha, the youngest child in the family. The film is quiet, it's also very powerful, very poignant. There are layers in their film that are beautiful to watch as they develop over time. The film premiered at TIFF, and it's made its way around different festival circuits to really great reviews. It's received awards as well. And the film is one that I recommend to you, friends. I don't want to tell you too much about the story because I think it needs to be experienced. You need to see it on a big screen if you can. And to learn more about the film, I leave you with my conversation with writer-director Sophy Romvari. Hi friends, it's Heidi M. You're not seeing me for this part, but I am sitting with filmmaker and writer Sophy Romvari. Sophy, thank you for being here.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So I normally start conversations like this by asking you to give us a bit of an intro about yourself. You're a writer, you're a filmmaker, you've done short films, and we're going to talk about your feature film, Blue Heron, today, but give us a little bit of a journey for you in terms of your career.
Sure, journey. So I'm originally from Vancouver Island. I grew up on Vancouver Island for the first 18 years of my life, and then I moved to Vancouver eventually, and I did my undergrad there in film. And after my undergrad, I started making short films, and I made many, many short films, and they're all sort of exploring memory, family, grief, dogs, dog grief.
Yes.
So I've been kind of focused on very similar themes throughout all my work, and I have these preoccupations that just come up very naturally. And then I moved to Toronto in 2017, and I did my master's here at York University, where I made a short film called Still Processing, which is my thesis film, which was probably the most closely related to Blue Heron. And after making that film, I started working on the development of this feature, which is my first feature and a fictional sort of representation of my own experiences. Yeah.
So I've seen the film now, and I will encourage folks to see it and hopefully see it big, because it's a different experience when you're seeing it on a big screen. So that will be my plug for now. But in the film, you're exploring, it's a fictionalized version of some of the stuff that you've grown up with in your family. And from the notes that you shared with us, which I'm really grateful for, there's this discussion about you were very intentional about the script, that you had some idea about what the characters would be doing and saying. So thinking of that journey of coming from the short films that were more documentary to a feature-length film, what have been some of the things that have sort of stayed with you now that you've seen the finished film, and also with audiences?
Yeah, I think because I was working in this mode of somewhere between fiction and documentary, I worked on the script to create the structure and the dialogue, and everything was already there. But what I wanted to have the film feel like was that it almost feels like a documentary.
Yes.
But everything in the film was pre-planned. So it's a fine balance to make something feel that spontaneous, or like almost like a home video. That was sort of the aesthetic that we were trying to capture with the long zoom lenses, this home video aesthetic, but also trying to have the structure be very, very formulated before going into the production. And I think it was important to me that the film had this very jarring structure, because for me that's true to my own experience in life. Is you get to a certain age and it feels like all of a sudden you are an adult, and you have to understand what came before you and how did you become the person you are. And if you're lucky like me, you have an art form that you can use to explore those ideas and express those ideas. And so I think I've always been very drawn to trying to understand myself, my family, my history more through the work that I make. And I think with each film I get a greater sense of access to answering those questions, really.
That makes sense. I think before we started, I was sharing with you that I was at a Q&A recently, and you, tying it up with what you're saying now, you talked about ruminating. And sort of, it could be seen, depending on who you are, it could be seen as a good or not so good thing. And you mentioned something about wanting to go to the root of things, and I think that's pretty succinct for this film, and wanting to make sense of things. You also talk about memories, and the film is very much about memories, but also, do we trust our memories or not so much? So can you talk a little bit on that, in terms of being someone who naturally is ruminating, as I am too? You know, I want to understand things, and what that journey is of that now having the finished film.
I think a big part of trying to get to the bottom of something is I think a big part of trying to get to the bottom of something is accepting that you can't. And I think that's ultimately what this film has become for me, is trying to understand something and then getting to the point where you've looked at it from every angle, from every perspective, and you have to come to a place of acceptance that you're ultimately not going to be able to figure out anything from a completely objective point of view. So everything is going to remain subjective, everything is going to remain in your own understanding of the world. So the version of this film that I made would be very different than the version of the film that someone else would make. For example, another member from my family, or any number of filmmakers who've tried to explore their own life experiences. Even if you're exploring similar themes, you're ultimately going to make something that is rooted in perspective. And I think a lot about perspective as a filmmaker.
Right.
And I wanted to root this in a perspective that I knew I could speak to, which is my own. But I think ultimately, I don't really believe in the ultimate truth. I think it's just, this is my truth, this is my version of my experiences, this is my artistic interpretation of my memories.
Right.
So I wasn't so focused on trying to recreate or make a completely sincere, step-by-step recreation of my childhood, because that's ultimately not what the film is about. It's not, and we all have our own life experiences, and part of my job as a filmmaker and artist is, how do I create something that is actually artistic and engaging and cinematic? So it's not everything that happens in our lives are those things.
Right.
So you have to find a way to be the vessel for those things, and if you want to tell personal stories, but you also have to find the line between what's actually going to invite people into your world versus exclude them. So I think I was trying to balance all those things.
At first I wasn't sure where things were going to go, and I know that I don't think I'm giving too much away by saying there's a couple of timelines here, and there's a collision of time in the film. And I think it's to your point of this is how you also experience time, right? When you are confronting memories and trying to make sense of them. And I'm curious about what your discussions were like with Amy Zimmer, who plays the adult version of you, and how to handle her coming into that timeline for the film.
That's a great question. I think working with Amy was a very, very collaborative and very natural process, actually, because she's very intelligent. She's also someone who loves cinema history and is a writer and a comedian and so many things. And so it was very easy to start diving into what is a character, but ultimately is also an amalgamation of both of our life experiences. And so a lot of the work that we did was just talking about our own lives and talking about what we felt, our own experiences could lend to this role. And so Sasha really became an amalgamation of myself, Amy, and Sasha as a character. And so when I watch the film, I don't think I'm looking into a mirror or something.
Right.
I see a character who is blended through this kind of empathetic performance that she gives. And she had maybe the most challenging role in many ways, because so much of her role is listening and digesting information, and then finally she has this moment of catharsis, but so much of her role is just the act of trying to understand, and it's actually quite a subtle thing to portray. And she was really open to the experiment of that, because there was a lot of spontaneity to her character, and especially when she was engaging with the social workers. And so she really took it on and was just so open. Yeah.
I really liked how you placed the audience in that space, because that's kind of how we deal with our lives day to day, or with life-changing events or things that happen to us. So I do appreciate that point of view that she brings in, and asking all the questions, like you said, with the social workers, for example. So yeah, Amy did really great. But I do want to also shout out your younger self version, or Sasha, the child version, and it's at Elul Guven. And there's a very special moment in the film where they both sort of are in the same space. Can you talk about that, setting up the scene and working with the two of them, and same kind of setup, I guess?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so Elul deserves many shout outs. She's a phenomenal young actor, and she actually is a very talented actor. I think it's easy to assume that you're when you're capturing a child performance that you're just witnessing a child, but in the instance of her, she's very different than this character. Actually, she's very talkative and hyperactive and full of energy, and very she's a gymnast. She's many things, and she's very self-motivated, and so working with her was just such a good experience for me. And if there is to be any healing, it was very much a beautiful thing to work with a young actor who took on this role. And she would come up to me sometimes and she would hug me and she would say, "I'm you."
Oh.
And so she was really, it really did feel like having this little inner child running around, which is also very meta, considering the scene that you're talking about. But she was just, she was phenomenal. And then Amy and Elul also bonded. That was a big part of my approach with the rehearsals, was getting the actors themselves to bond outside of being on set. And so on the weekends, like, Amy went hiking with Elul and her parents, and they got to know each other, and very naturally they were just very drawn to each other. So it was very special. But that moment was very delicate, because there's a way to do that could be quite trite, and I really want it to be subtle. And it was less about the interaction and more about her being in the space with her brother as well. Yeah. Because her brother, at this point in her life, as you find out, is no longer living. So for her, she's trying to not reveal that to the younger self. So she's doing a lot of different things in that scene. So she's seeing herself, which on some level is emotional, but for her, she's trying to withhold emotion for seeing her brother in a moment that is kind of in a liminal space between life and death. And I wanted it to be light in a way too, that she can interact with this child self without it being a heavy sort of she could reveal to her all these things, but that's not the time for it. I want there to be an innocence to that. And I also didn't want her to I didn't want there to be any sense of like a rescue in that moment either, with her younger self. Like, she has to kind of leave things as they are. And then when she leaves with Jeremy, I was trying to mimic what she would have witnessed as a child, with her brother leaving with the social worker. Yeah, so there's all these little parallels that I was trying to show.
So let's stay with the brother, Jeremy. Another great casting with Eric, and my understanding is this is they're not actors? Like
Yeah,
he's not an actor?
He's
or?
not an actor. He's never acted.
Okay.
He was street cast, and he had no intention of being an actor. So
Right.
him being in this film was very much an exercise of trust for him and for me to take this challenge on. But he was just so wonderful and so open to it. I think he had a very unique perspective on the role and has his own personal connections to the role as well. He's also an immigrant from Kyrgyzstan, and Eylul's family is from Turkey, and the parents are both immigrants within Europe as well, and
Right.
the boys. So almost everyone in the film, the younger boys as well, came from an immigrant family. So
Right.
everyone was bringing their own lived experience to the roles as
experience.
well. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, what he did with Jeremy was so also very special because Jeremy doesn't speak much. So we are feeling him, we're seeing him. He's, you know, similar to what's happening in the film. We are piecing who he is based on what others are seeing, what they're saying. So how much direction did you give Edek, and how much was he intuitive in terms of that role?
It's a great question. I think he does have a really great intuition. I think there was many times when I would give him a direction, and right before I was going to speak, he would say, "Oh, should I move to the left a little, or should I?" You know, he was starting to pick up on things just naturally, and I think part of what created that sense of comfort was he was really brought in by the rest of the actors and the family, like the actors who play the family, the parents. We spent a lot of time getting to know each other and bonding before we got to set, and so I think he felt, I don't want to speak for him, but I do think he felt that everyone was there to also support his experience, and there wasn't an expectation of him to do something that he was not comfortable doing, even though he was challenged. But I think he really surprised himself.
Yeah, I think it comes through on screen really, really well. And I mean, I really loved being in that. Well, we can talk about the space in a minute, but I like being in the space with that family because they really did feel like a family. So I think that's a testament to your casting and the work that you did, I guess, before to establish that relationship. I'm probably going to speak to the cinematographer at some point, but I want to talk about location. You mentioned this before in another Q&A around you being limited funding, which is, you know, this is the Talent to Watch film, which you did so great with in terms of what was accomplished. And having to work with that limited budget meant a one-level house, maybe even time constrictions. But let's talk about, you know, what you saw in that house in particular that was special, because he kind of becomes another character in that story.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I think limitations are the fruit of imagination, because it forces you to think outside the box and to do things that if you had a lot of money, you might not do. So I think that there's a sweet spot of just enough money, and I feel like we had that because it was just enough to get the film made exactly in the way that I wanted to make it.
Right.
And I think as soon as you have an excess, then you start to think, should I do something bigger? Should I do more? But I wanted to keep the story very contained. Like, for example, I didn't want there to be any extras because for me, if this film is ultimately about memory, there's no extras in your memories.
Right.
So, but that's also a financial benefit to the film. So I was always trying to balance like the artistic intention with the economic one. And when I wrote the script, I wrote it for Talent to Watch. So I wrote something that I knew would be contained within these limitations, but that allowed it to be more intimate and more, specific. Whereas if I had a bigger budget, then maybe I would start to, dream up weird fantasy sequences or something. You start to fill in the holes with bigger things that you don't necessarily need. So I think it's always important for me to think, what do I actually need to tell this story?
Right.
And sometimes it's just a camera and a laptop and a dog or whatever.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's also good for folks to understand that you do have that understanding yourself of these are potential limitations, but I'm going to make them, excel in some way. So let's talk about because you've done documentaries in your short. So, what would have been anything that you did different for these feature film that's more fiction or your process is still pretty much the same?
I think that I like to think about so in terms of documentary versus fiction, I really think I don't like to think about the difference for me. Like I find I take tools from documentary filmmaking and I apply them to fiction filmmaking and vice versa.
Yes.
I think I like to blend the two together because for me it's always just about how do I achieve the greatest sense of authenticity. And I think when I say authenticity, I mean like the perception of authenticity.
Okay. Yes.
Because I don't believe you can really capture truth necessarily, even in documentary. There's always an element of construction.
Yes.
So how do I take this concept of truth and then apply it to fiction and get to the most authentic version of that? So I really like taking the two and using tools from documentary to feel the naturalism, but then it's ultimately a very scripted and structured thing. So you balance the two things out, and I think that's what makes the film feel how it feels.
Yeah, no, it's really great. So I'm gonna wrap up now, but I'm thinking about moving towards the end of the film, and like you said, Sasha has this sort of time where she hopefully understands her brother Jeremy a little bit better because of other people's writings. There's a letter. Am I giving too much away? Oh, maybe. But so there's almost like a shift there emotionally, for at least for me as an audience member. I noticed a shift, and I was wondering if you thought of this as maybe a different way for her to cope with her grief or reframe the grief that she's lived with.
Yeah, I do think the film is ultimately about an acceptance of not being able to change the past, an acceptance of not being able to understand someone that is gone, or being able to even recreate that person.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately by the end of the film, there's still questions, but I think she's accepting that there's not necessarily going to be answers. And that was a big part of the process of making the film. And I think that's part of the beauty of making art, is you get to explore those things in a nuanced way, but it's not scientific. You're not going to come out the other side with new answers to these questions.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.